All right, so pork barrel spending is federal spending that goes to a specific legislative district or a specific state. So it is federal spending that does not benefit the nation as a whole, or does not directly benefit the nation as a whole. It is federal spending that goes to a specific legislative district or to a specific state. Pork barrel spending has a negative connotation. Even the term pork barrel spending is derived from slavery, from language that was used surrounding the institution of slavery. And so at its core, it has a negative connotation. And pork barrel spending, as that term is currently used, has a negative connotation because some people view it as wasteful, that it's federal dollars that are only benefiting one specific district or one specific state. The benefit of pork barrel spending is that it helps to facilitate the legislative process because it encourages people to move forward with legislation that they otherwise might not want to move forward with. And it also allows for the opportunity for cooperation. If you vote in favor of my bill with pork barrel spending, then I will vote in favor of your bill with pork barrel spending. So it allows for that type of congressional negotiation, which can help to facilitate the legislative process. The term log rolling generally refers to pushing a bill through Congress, kind of as rapidly as possible, trying to get a bill through Congress. Sometimes the term log rolling is more specifically used to describe that type of negotiation. You vote for my legislation, I'll vote for yours. And again, that helps to facilitate the legislative process. If you are interested in a little bit more information about this topic, I don't want to click because my computer's been a bit glitchy today, but on the next slide, there is a textbook excerpt specifically about pork barrel spending and log rolling, which you might want to take a look at. Do you need to know those terms for tomorrow's FRQ? No, but we need to know them in general. All right, let's talk about oversight. The term oversight generally means one branch's ability to control the actions of another branch, to manipulate and control the actions of another branch. Congressional oversight is Congress's ability to control the actions of the other branches. And the best, most effective form of congressional oversight is the power of the purse. Their ability to control funding allows them to exercise a lot of oversight, particularly of the executive branch and the bureaucracy. So oversight is Congress's ability to manipulate other branches. Roman, shut the door for me, please. Spending and the power of the purse is one of Congress's most effective ways to exercise oversight. Constituency is the people that members of Congress represent. For senators, the entire state is their constituency, and we would call those individual people their constituents. For representatives to the House, because they serve specific legislative districts, we would call the people of that legislative district their constituency, and then we would call those individuals their constituents. Let's get through one more conversation, and then I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions about those vocab words and this next topic. All right, this next topic all has to do with legislative districts. In the House of Representatives, each representative serves a specific legislative district. In Pennsylvania, for example, we currently have 18 representatives to the House. After reapportionment based on the 2020 census, we will have 17 representatives in the House. Those representatives have to come from specific legislative districts. So the state of Pennsylvania was apportioned based on the census, 17 representatives. Apportionment is the process of dividing up the 435 representatives to the House based on population. So Pennsylvania was apportioned 17 representatives based on the 2020 census, and Pennsylvania has to be divided into 17 legislative districts. It is our state legislature's job to draw those district lines. So our legislature in Harrisburg has to draw our 17 legislative districts. In theory, there are a couple of things that they should avoid when doing that. In theory, when drawing legislative districts, state legislatures should avoid gerrymandering and malapportionment. But let's delve into what that means. Gerrymandering is drawing legislative districts in excessively odd shapes, often to benefit one political party versus another. There were accusations of gerrymandering in Pennsylvania after the 2020 reapportionment and redistricting. We talked about that fallout and that process a little bit earlier in our chapter. To a certain extent, almost every legislative district is a little bit gerrymandered. The party that's drawing the districts is going to try to draw the districts to their benefits, whether we're talking about the Republican or the Democratic Party. When we get into egregious gerrymandering, like legislative districts that are incredibly oddly shaped, and it's very clear that they are only drawn that way to benefit one party or another, or legislative districts that are only contiguous because of a strip of highway or something, that's when people start to question the legitimacy of the legislative districts, and that's when on a state level people might take action against gerrymandering, like what happened in Pennsylvania in 2010, 2011-ish. When drawing these legislative districts, states should also avoid something called malapportionment. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. In addition to partisan gerrymandering, and kind of as part of partisan gerrymandering, is the potential for racial gerrymandering. And we saw a discussion of racial gerrymandering when we talked about one of our required court cases, Shaw v. Reno. In Shaw v. Reno, there were accusations of racial gerrymandering where the districts were drawn in really odd shapes to intentionally create what were called majority-minority districts. In the state of North Carolina, African Americans are in the numerical minority, but these districts were drawn so that a few of them were intentionally majority-minority, where African Americans held the majority in multiple districts. In Shaw v. Reno, the Supreme Court said that while the intentions were good, and while the intentions were to try to amplify the African American voice in the vote, that egregiously drawing legislative districts in weird shapes to intentionally create majority-minority districts is a violation of your 14th Amendment equal protection rights. When drawing legislative districts, states should also avoid malapportionment. And malapportionment is when legislative districts are drawn so that the population within is significantly unequal. This helps to explain why legislative districts are often geographically very different in size. If you look at the state of Pennsylvania, the legislative districts in the center of the state are geographically quite large. And the legislative districts surrounding Philadelphia are geographically quite small. But the population within those legislative districts is approximately the same. One of our required court cases, Baker v. Carr, says that malapportionment is a violation of your 14th Amendment equal protection rights. And the conversation surrounding malapportionment has resulted in a famous quotation, "One person, one vote." My vote should be as impactful as your vote. My influence on my representative to Congress should be as impactful as your influence on your representative to Congress. And if I live in a district that has been malapportioned, if I live in a district that has a giant population, and you live in a district that has a teeny tiny population, one could argue that my voice is not as impactful as your voice. And that is why malapportionment is considered a violation of your 14th Amendment equal protection rights, according to Baker v. Carr, which is one of our required Supreme Court cases. So I want to pause here and answer any questions that you have about that early vocabulary, pork barrel spending, log rolling oversight, constituency, and then this conversation about congressional legislative districts. Questions just about that chunk. Okay, if you don't feel comfortable asking questions now, there might be a couple of minutes at the end of class, and I'm going to have my Zoom room turned on after school. Stop by if you would rather ask questions in that setting. You can also email me to answer questions, but I go to bed early. I'm a beaten down woman over here. So if you email me after like 8 o'clock, I'm not going to be able to get back to you tonight. So if you have questions about this stuff that you need answered for sure before tomorrow, then you need to email me before 8 o'clock. Okay, let's move on to our next section here. Incumbency means that you are the person that is currently holding that position. In 2020, in the presidential race, President Donald Trump was the incumbent and Joe Biden was the challenger. Political scientists have observed that it is very difficult to defeat a congressional incumbent. And we talked about why, along with our conversation about why there is a phenomenon known as the sophomore surge. The sophomore surge is an increase in votes congressional incumbents tend to receive the first time they run for re-election. Those are two separate concepts. They have the exact same set of reasons for why they exist. It is very difficult to defeat a congressional incumbent because they already have a voter base and they already have a donor base. There are already people that have gone out and voted for them in the past. There are already people that have donated to their campaign in the past. Congressional incumbents also experience incumbency advantage because they often have better access to the media than their challenger. Congressional incumbents can use their offices to provide services to their constituents. They can answer constituents' questions about taxation. They can help constituents work through issues they're having with the federal government. They can give constituents tickets to tour the Capitol building. That's to their benefit, and it leads to incumbency advantage. We've also noticed that congressional incumbents are very good at claiming to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Congress's overall approval rating is very low. It's been hovering below 30% for the past decade or so. So it is fascinating that Congress's overall approval rating is low, but we keep reelecting the same people. And it has proven to be fairly easy for a member of Congress to say, oh, I'm not like them. I'm there to help them. I'm going to clean up the very institution that I am a part of and the very institution that has such a low approval rating. So that's part of incumbency advantage, the ability for our members of Congress to differentiate themselves from the rest of Congress. Lastly, we talked about how members of Congress have franking privileges. They can send mail for free. They cannot send campaign materials for free, but they can send information to their constituents for free. And at a minimum, that is exposing their constituents to their name. It's sending a piece of mail to their constituent's house that has their name on it, which is to their advantage versus their challenger. So questions about incumbency advantage before we talk about Congress leadership structure. Okay, let's talk leadership structure in the House and then leadership structure in the Senate. And then we're going to talk about differences in the House and Senate. Tomorrow's FRQ focuses on House and Senate procedures and House and Senate differences. So I'm not even going to dance around this hint. It's not even a hint. This next conversation that we're going to have is what your FRQ is focused on. So give me a minute to get through it, and then I'll open it up to questions. All right, let's start with House leadership structure. Most powerful person in the House is the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House is selected from within the majority party. The House also has majority and minority leaders. The House also has majority and minority whips. Because the House has more people, there are more rules. And when there are more rules, the people in charge of those rules tend to wield more power. And that helps to explain why typically, with the exception of individual powerful personalities, like actual individual people, generally, the House of Representatives has stronger leadership and weaker individual members, and the Senate tends to have weaker leadership and stronger individual members. I am skipping over Political Action Committee because we didn't talk about that this chapter. It's not on your test, and it's something that we're going to talk a lot more about in a future chapter. So I know what I'm doing there. It's intentional. Don't worry about it. All right, let's talk about Senate leadership. The Vice President is President of the Senate, and that is one of the few constitutional powers that the Vice President has. The Vice President does not go to the Senate on a daily basis. History and tradition has led to a relationship where the Vice President goes to the Senate only when there's a tie to break. When she is not there, those responsibilities fall to a position known as the President pro tempore of the Senate, Latin for like the temporary president of the Senate. Even the President pro tempore does not have a lot of real legislative power. Where we see a lot of the legislative power in the Senate is in the majority and minority leaders. And the Senate also has majority and minority whips. We spent a bit of this conversation talking about the benefits of being the majority party beyond the numerical benefits of the vote. Certainly, if you are of the majority party, that is to your benefit when it comes time to vote because there's more of you. But there are other benefits to being in the majority party all throughout the legislative process. If you're in the majority party, you get to pick the Speaker of the House of Representatives. If you are in the majority party, you get to pick the majority leader of the House and the majority leader of the Senate. If you are in the majority party, you get to chair almost all the committees and certainly the most important committees. And if you are in the majority party, you are certainly going to fill the majority of the seats on the most important and influential committees. One such committee is the House Rules Committee. So this is a committee that only exists in the House. It's called the House Rules Committee. You better believe that the majority party is going to chair the House Rules Committee, and the majority party is going to dominate the House Rules Committee. There have been instances where the majority party fills every single seat in the House Rules Committee. It doesn't give any seats in the Rules Committee to the minority party sometimes. And that's because the House Rules Committee controls much of the debate. And when you're able to control much of the process and much of the debate, you have a lot of control over the outcome. So the House Rules Committee is scheduling when bills will be debated, for how long bills will be debated, who gets to talk about the bills and for how long, what type of amendments are allowed to be added to the bills. That's all coming from the House Rules Committee. So the majority party gets to dominate the House Rules Committee. The House Rules Committee has a ton of power and ends up having a significant amount of influence over the way that bills work their way through the House and the potential for those bills to get passed into law. While we're on the topic of something that exists in the House and not the Senate, let's continue talking about differences between the House and the Senate. So the House has the House Rules Committee, very influential over the process, in turn very influential oftentimes over the outcome, absolutely going to be dominated by the majority party. The House also has something called a discharge petition. Let's explain what that is. As you know, the vast majority of Congress's work is done in standing committees. It is in standing committees where they research and discuss and write legislation. Standing committees do not have to report the bill before the full House or before the full Senate for floor debates. They don't have to. And that's why most bills die in committee. That's where most bills stop. Most of the time, the standing committee decides we don't want to report this before the full House or before the full Senate. We don't want this to be brought to floor debate in the House or the Senate. In the House, there is the potential for something called a discharge petition. And a discharge petition is when enough people sign a petition to force the standing committee to report the bill before the full House. Discharge petitions do not exist in the Senate. They only exist in the House. They rarely work. It's rare to get enough people together to effectively create a discharge petition. But what it is forcing a standing committee in the House to report a bill before the full House for floor debate. In a counterintuitive way, discharge petitions are an example of how individual members are weaker in the House than they are in the Senate. And I say in a counterintuitive way because a discharge petition is an extra power, right? It's something that the House has that the Senate does not. But in the Senate, if the standing committee does not want to report a bill before the full Senate, they absolutely do not have to. And there is nothing that you can do about it. So that shows that those individual members have a lot of power. One standing committee, the few members of the Senate in that one standing committee have the full power to decide if they want to move forward with a piece of legislation or not. In the House, if a standing committee does not want to report a bill before the full House, they can be forced to with a discharge petition. Rarely does a discharge petition work, but it's an option. It's a check on the power of those standing committees. So discharge petitions exist in the House. They do not exist in the Senate. Last thing that exists in the House, but not the Senate, is the potential to function as what is known as committee of the whole. Floor debate in the House takes place as a committee of the whole. And that is basically when the House functions under committee rules. The whole House pretends like it's one big committee and functions under committee rules. And that reduces the rules that need to be followed. It helps to expedite the process by reducing the rules that need to be followed. Floor debate in the House can take place as committee of the whole. Committee of the whole also reduces the number of people necessary for there to be a quorum, so they can function with fewer people. Only floor debate can happen as a committee of the whole. When it's time to vote, full official rules are back in effect, and at least half the members of the House have to be there for there to be a quorum. So committee of the whole is something that exists in the House, but not the Senate. Committee of the whole allows the entire House of Representatives to function under committee rules. I'm actually going to pause here before we move on to stuff that exists in the Senate. So questions about stuff that exists only in the House. Okay, I'm going to talk about stuff that only exists in the Senate, and then I'll pause again, so there'll be more opportunities to ask questions. All right. Here's stuff that only exists in the Senate. And what you'll notice about the stuff that exists in the Senate is it largely stems from there being fewer rules in the Senate. So for example, the Senate has the potential for something called a hold. And a hold is when a member of the Senate says to the floor leader, the person that's in charge of floor debate, that person is going to be either the majority leader or someone picked by the majority leader. When a senator says to the person in charge of debate, I don't want to move forward with this legislation. I don't want it to pass. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I don't want to move forward. The floor leader can take that information into account as much or as little as he or she would like. They could say, okay, fine, then we won't. This bill's dead, we won't talk about it anymore. Or they could say, tough luck, we're going to continue talking about this legislation. Sometimes a hold is viewed as a filibuster warning. Like, heads up, I don't want to move forward with this legislation. I'm letting you know that in a crystal clear fashion. And if you choose to move forward with this legislation, I'm going to filibuster it. Sometimes that's how a hold is used. Holds exist in the Senate. Holds do not exist in the House. Unanimous consent agreements exist in the Senate, but not the House. A unanimous consent agreement is when every senator decides to make a rule change. Unanimous, everyone, consent, agree. It allows for the Senate to quickly make a rule change while they're in the midst of floor debate. Hey, do we all agree that we should make this quick change? Everyone say aye, then we go ahead and we quickly make that rule change. Unanimous consent agreements only exist in the Senate. They don't exist in the House. And then that brings us to the filibuster, which we spent a whole day talking about. The concept of the filibuster stems from there being fewer rules in the Senate, and as a result, the potential for unlimited debate. So a filibuster is when someone talks for so long, holds the Senate floor for so long, that it destroys a bill's chance of passage. The filibuster is one of the most significant powers, if not the most significant power of the minority party. Without the filibuster, the majority party could put something to a vote and pass that legislation without having to cooperate with a single member of the minority party. So the filibuster is the most effective way for the minority party to stop a bill's passage. Listen closely to this next piece. A filibuster can only end once someone invokes cloture. To invoke cloture means that the majority party garners 60 votes. 60 votes. Stop, that's too loud, Mom. That's too loud. The majority party has to garner 60 votes, and that allows them to stop a filibuster, invoke cloture, and stop a filibuster. If the minority party is filibustering, the majority party can stop a filibuster by invoking cloture, which requires 60 votes. So there's a reason why I'm saying this for a third time now. Hint, hint, wink, wink. If the minority party filibusters, the majority party can end a filibuster by invoking cloture, but that requires 60 votes. A filibuster is successful if the person holds the floor for so long that there's no longer a quorum, there's not enough people to conduct business, the majority party was not able to invoke cloture, and they've destroyed that bill's chance of passage. Once a bill passes through the House and the Senate, it shows up on the desk of the president. The Constitution says that a simple majority passes a bill through the House and through the Senate. However, if the minority party filibusters in the Senate, then the majority party would have to garner 60 votes to invoke cloture, end that filibuster, and move forward with that piece of legislation. But let's say it passes through the House and the Senate. It shows up on the desk of the president, and he's got three options. He can sign it into law. He can veto it, issue a veto message. If he vetoes it, it goes back to the House that it originated in. It has to pass there with a 2/3 vote. Then it goes to the other chamber, has to pass there with a 2/3 vote. And if they can do that, it becomes a law without the president's signature. His third option is to do nothing, If he does nothing, after 10 days, it becomes a law without his signature. There's an exception to that rule. If within those 10 days Congress adjourns, that is a pocket veto. A pocket veto cannot be overridden. Congress would need to start from scratch with that idea in the next session of Congress if they really wanted to pass that type of legislation. Questions about stuff that is unique to the Senate. All right, I know we don't have that much time left, but the rest of this conversation happens very quickly. The Office of Management and Budget is actually an executive branch agency, and it was created to allow the president to draft his version of the budget and then communicate that with Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress makes the budget. But the Office of Management and Budget allows the president and Congress to work together in the budget making process. It also helps to keep tabs on executive branch spending. So it was an office created to facilitate the budget making process and particularly to facilitate the president's role in the budget making process. Speaking of the budget, we talked about how much of the budget is locked up in what are known as entitlement programs. And entitlement programs are called entitlement programs because the government has said that you are entitled to those benefits. Social Security, Medicare, those are clear examples of entitlement programs. People often consider unemployment, Medicaid, temporary assistance for needy families to be examples of entitlement programs as well. The government has said through federal law that you are entitled to those benefits. And so the government has said that a reduction or elimination of those benefits would be a violation of your rights. That's what makes entitlements part of a larger collection of spending known as mandatory spending. Entitlement programs are programs you are entitled to by law. And that makes spending on those programs mandatory. Spending that is locked into the budget. So entitlement programs are a big piece of the mandatory spending pie. Mandatory spending is a big piece of the overall budget pie. A lot of our federal budget is locked into what we would consider mandatory spending, spending that we've already committed to. That leaves us with discretionary spending. That is spending that is more easily manipulated from year to year. And discretionary spending is actually a smaller piece of the budget pie than mandatory spending. It includes things like infrastructure spending, education spending, spending on the arts. Those things are more easily manipulated from year to year. A budget surplus is when the government takes in more money than it spends. That never happens. So that would be when they are collecting more money in tax revenue than they are spending. What we see are budget deficits. Budget deficits are when we spend more than we are taking in. There were a couple of years, most recently in the 1990s, where we had no budget deficit, where the government was taking in the same amount of money that it was spending, but more often than not, we are functioning on a budget deficit where we are spending more than we are taking in. That leads us to the national debt. The national debt is a collection of all of the deficits since the beginning of the United States. All of the debt that we have accrued since the beginning of the US, and it is hovering at just below $29 trillion currently. Delegate, trustee, and politico, those are vocab words that we went over yesterday. You read about them for today. If you haven't read about them for today, I recommend you take the time to do so. The delegate role refers to the belief that we elect members of Congress and they should speak on our behalf exactly as we would want them to. So we elect them and they should make decisions that are very in line with what their constituents want. Members of the House are more likely to act as delegates because they serve 2-year terms and they represent specific legislative districts. The trustee role is this belief that we elect people and then we have faith in their decision making. We entrust them to make decisions on our behalf. They can make decisions as they see fit. Members of the Senate are more likely to act as trustees. They serve 6-year terms and they represent the entire state. The political role is probably the most accurate way to describe members of Congress because it takes into account multiple pressures. The way that their constituents feel, the way that they feel, the way that their political party feels. So it acknowledges those multiple pressures. Last chunk of vocab stems from yesterday's discussion about how people feel about divided government. Bipartisanship is when the two parties can work together, cooperation between the two parties. Gridlock is the belief that it's very difficult to get things done in government and that it's easier to block action than to take action in government. We spent a lot of time yesterday analyzing how gridlock has a negative connotation, and when the government can't figure out a way to keep itself funded and is threatening a shutdown, then gridlock is probably deserving of its negative connotation. But the authors of the Constitution intended for there to be gridlock, because if it's easy to get good stuff done, then it's easy to get bad stuff done. So they wanted the legislative process to be difficult and thoughtful and full of necessary compromise and cooperation. Divided government is when one or both houses of Congress are controlled by a different political party than the president. We are currently functioning under a unified government, which is relatively rare. A unified government is when the same party controls both houses of Congress and the presidency. Divided government is when the president is of one political party and one or both chambers of Congress are dominated by another political party. Lame duck is something that we didn't talk about this chapter. We're going to talk about it a lot in our next chapter, and it's not on your assessment tomorrow.